Welcome, everybody. My name is Eric Liu, and I'm so delighted to be spending the next 90 minutes with all of you here. I come here wearing a couple of different hats. I run a program at the Aspen Institute on citizenship and American identity with my colleague and partner in crime, Carrie Hopper, who Carrie's in the back. Please wave right there, because she'll be part of our conversations throughout the day. And I also run an organization, a nonprofit based in Seattle that works nationally called Citizen University. Those of you who were in this room just for the previous session on voting heard a little bit about our work. And the work there at Citizen University is all about teaching powerful citizenship and activating literacy in power in civic life. But it's really the work of the Aspen program that I wanted to share this afternoon during this deep dive session. And so let me give us a little bit of a roadmap of how we're going to spend these 90 minutes together. I'm going to spend, 10, 12 minutes here giving you a bit of an introductory frame for a project that we're running out of our program at Aspen called the Better Arguments Project. And I'll tell you a little bit about the provenance of that project and the purpose of it. And then we're going to spend a chunk of about 20 minutes or so combined in conversation with each other. And I will give you some guidelines on that when the time comes. It'll come in two segments with two different questions during which you'll be asked to turn to somebody, preferably somebody you don't already know, so you might want to turn your chair around behind you when that time comes. And then I and Carrie and a couple other folks work in the room with mics. Will bring in some of your thoughts and comments from those two queries, which will then sort of Socratically inform a bit of tying together of some of these themes around better arguments. And then we will have the balance and the bulk of our time together in a panel conversation with our four very distinguished panelists who I'll introduce at that point. And we will be sure to leave in time during that for Q&A and conversation in the midst of that as well. So that's the arc of our time together, and it'll fly by. So let me get started here. Can Americans come together by arguing better? That's the question that we're posing here today. And it's perhaps counterintuitive to some of you that we live in a time right now where the facts and the impressions don't need to be recited or rehearsed, a time of record polarization, a time of unbelievable vitriol in our political and civic life and culture, and a time where on everything from cable news to social media and increasingly in face-to-face settings, argument in a scorched earth, deeply personal way is becoming the new normal. And so it would seem kind of counterintuitive to say, gosh, what we need in this country right now is more arguing. But I want to explain why it is that that might be so. Our view at the Aspen Institute, and particularly in our program on citizenship and American identity, is that one of the things that actually is dangerous is when you rush to reconciliation and reunion. And this thought comes out of our work in general, comes out of a piece that I wrote for The Atlantic about a week before the 2016 presidential election. You may recall, if you can actually remember that far back in time, in that different world, that about a week before the election, there was a general conventional wisdom, though lots of people were unsure and a little bit nervous, a general conventional wisdom that Hillary Clinton would win, and that the big question that the country would face the day after the election would be, how are we going to reconcile? How are we going to bring back into the fold all of these tens of millions of people who voted for Donald Trump and who were so angry with the system that they brought this country this close to making Donald Trump president? And what I said in this article in The Atlantic was not so fast on two counts. Number one, it wasn't at all clear to me at that time that, in fact, Hillary Clinton would win. But number two, whoever was going to win that election, one thing that history teaches us in the United States is that oftentimes a rush to reconciliation, a rush to reunion, can be used to paper over deep, abiding differences in worldview, and also to paper over deep, abiding injustices and inequities in civic life. If you think about the history of the Civil War and the period after the Civil War, and the ways in which the United States, frankly, just got tired of how hard Reconstruction was. It was hard work to bring all those freedmen into the fold. It was hard work, actually, to ensure that the 15th Amendment was going to be put into effect. It was hard work, actually, to make sure that personhood and citizenship and the franchise would in fact be guaranteed to the once enslaved. And after 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, the country was like, you know what? This is really just divisive and hard, and it's a slog, and it's making us not be able to kind of resolve and bind up the wounds of our country. And you started to get this wave of sentiment in both the North and the South calling for reunion. That it was time for the North and South finally to put behind all of this nastiness, to put behind all of the troubles of the war, and to put behind all the divisiveness that was being caused by Reconstruction. And we did. In 1876 and 1877, we abandoned Reconstruction in the name of reunion, and thus began a period of time, not just with the resurgence of a revanchist white supremacist South, but also the idea that a narrative began to take hold that what needed to be remembered most in America was that white men and white women of the North and the South were brothers and sisters. And that's what this country had to live by. And that is a signal example, but there are many other examples in our country's history of when a rush to reunion can actually be a negative thing. But that was only one part of the point that I was making in this piece. The other part, which actually yielded the project that we're going to be talking about today, was this notion. And it is that we have to remember that American civic life actually is an argument. That the whole point of America is, in fact, at every turn, to be engaged in argument. And that the idea that we should be arguing less, that we should be not fighting so much, that we'd be trying to find common ground and build bridges, though understandable and to be admired in some contexts, again, can make us forget that at the foundational level, America is this perpetual, unresolvable fight among core principles. That we are always arguing in this country between liberty and equality. And we say those words as if they're equal and interchangeable, and we forget that when one side gets a little too much liberty, that tends to make the other side or another group of people have to give up on their dreams of equality. Conversely, when one side or one group starts being able to dominate and saying we've got to be all about equality, that starts to step on a lot of people's notion of their liberty. That liberty and equality are perpetually in tension, right? But that's not the only core argument that's in American life. That, of course, the federalist and the anti-federalist view of the role of government, the relationship of people to their government, that thank goodness, the musical Hamilton has made accessible to millions more people, whether it's a Hamilton view of strong central national government or a Jefferson view of local control and states' rights and so forth, right? That's another core abiding argument in American life. The argument that is actually embedded in our national motto, the pluribus versus the unum. Are we a country that is meant to celebrate the full breadth and beauty of our diversity and to highlight and to elevate that difference and diversity? Or are we a country that is meant to actually smooth over, paper over, or transcend that diversity in the unum that is unifying and that binds us across all of that difference? There is in all of these no right or wrong, right? These are perpetual tugs of war. The idea that personal responsibility and collective responsibility are both part of the American DNA. The idea of rugged individualism and collective action. The idea that the barn raising and the D-Day landing are both part of our national iconography, symbolically and emotionally. That these are both parts of what we do. That the cowboy riding alone to the sunset and the collective creating towns like Aspen, not alone but together. These perpetual core tensions in American civic life are things that we've got to actually remember are real and abiding, and as I say, are perpetually unresolvable. That indeed, God help us if one side should ever achieve final victory in some of these arguments. If liberty achieves final victory over equality. If strong national government achieves final victory over local control and local voice. Then God help us, because then we will not be the kind of country that we are meant to be, which is perpetually trying to navigate these tugs of war. And so this was the essence of the piece that I wrote in The Atlantic, and I can boil it down by saying what we need in American civic life today isn't fewer arguments. What we need is just less stupid arguments. And I don't mean to be glib there, as we will talk about going on this afternoon. Less stupid means several concrete things. It means, in the first place, a bit of what I'm talking about here, arguments that are more, in fact, grounded philosophically and historically in the inheritance of our creed and the actual facts of history over the ways we have contested that creed from the beginning of the Republic. But there are other dimensions as well of a less stupid argument, or if you put it more affirmatively, a better argument that we will unpack as we go today. And out of the inspiration of that article, the response to which was tremendous, we decided at our program here at Aspen to create something called the Better Arguments Project. And the Better Arguments Project is a partnership with the Allstate Corporation and our friends at Facing History and Ourselves, a fantastic nonprofit organization that I hope all of you learn about if you don't know about it already. They work around the United States, started in Boston, and they began 40 plus years ago as a Holocaust education organization, but expanded over the years beyond those teachings to a broader curriculum around moral choice making, working with high school students around the United States about how you make moral choices, how you know your own mind and your own heart when push comes to shove in public life, right? Not just when you're studying it in school, but when you're on a bus and somebody mistreats somebody else, what are you going to do? Are you going to be a bystander or an upstander, right? When you see an argument unfolding in the street in a way that you know is going to go sideways and maybe get violent, do you walk past or do you step in and engage? Facing History has been teaching young people around the country to be upstanders and to recognize that moral choice making at even the smallest level is deeply, deeply contagious in civic life. And so we've partnered with them to create this project that we call the Better Arguments Project. And the Better Arguments Project, we launched about a year and a quarter ago now, and we've been going around the United States in this first phase, basically doing focus groups with different groups of communities of all kinds, from coast to coast, with people who are sometimes expert in politics and culture and ideas, and other times people who are just everyday engaged citizens who haven't particularly thought about these questions or these topics. And we asked them a couple of questions, which I will be asking you in a moment. But out of all of these focus groups that we've been doing around the country, we've come to some learnings about both what it is that makes a better argument, but also what it is that makes a culture of argument toxic and a culture of argument destructive in civic life, right? And I think one of the things that when the polity was much smaller, during the previous session I was talking about a program of ours at Citizen University called The Joy of Voting, in which we are trying to rekindle at the local level this joyful, creative, raucous participatory culture around local voting and elections that used to exist in this country 200 years ago, right? Street theater, open-air debates, and bonfires and all that kind of stuff, immigrant parades about getting out the vote and so forth. The thing about that old culture of the joy of voting was that that was taking place in a time when the electorate did not include many of us in this room, when the polity did not include any of the women in this room, right? And so we've got a challenge now, which is also an opportunity, and is indeed the challenge and opportunity that all of our national politics is struggling with right now, of what do we do in trying to actually be planet Earth's first mass multicultural democratic republic? How do we actually do that? How do we actually deliver on the promise of equal justice for all and a democracy that works for all and the creed and the promise of our Constitution in a way that actually brings into the fold an electorate that is as diverse as our nation? Well, our view is that that's going to be hard and that's going to be painful. And there are deep abiding differences of philosophy about government, about business, about the role and size of government, but there are also deep abiding fears right now about identity, about who is us, about whether America is a white Christian nation or not, about what America would become if it were not a white Christian nation. And all these deep, deep abiding fears are drivers of argument that we can't put our head in the sand about. Either we reckon with them and we face them and we learn to have these arguments better, or we lapse more deeply into what Carl Bernstein, of Woodward and Bernstein fame, has already begun to call our cold civil war. We are in the midst, the early days of a cold civil war right now, right? Some have likened it to a soft divorce in national politics. Either way, that's not a path that we want to go down as a union. And so our work at the Better Arguments Project has been, in the first place, to go to communities, to do these focus group conversations, and to listen and to hear about folks living on the ground in their communities about what it means to build a more constructive culture of debate, conversation, and argument. And then beyond that, then, how we actually change norms nationally. I'm going to tell you more in a moment about what we've learned from that work and how in these focus groups and these conversations around the United States, we are preparing for the second phase of the work of the Better Arguments Project, which is going to bring in educators and activists and civic catalysts like many of you here in this room. But I'm going to do that in a moment. Right now, actually, I want to bring us all into the conversation. And the thing that I'd like to do, actually, is very simple. We have a very simple question, which is one that we begin with, whether it was with high school students in Chicago, or with political experts in DC, or with business leaders out in Seattle. We asked them a very simple question. What makes a bad argument? In your life, in your experience, I think many of us kind of more readily can, just in our personal lives, conjure up a moment and experience of a bad argument. It doesn't even have to be a political argument, any kind of argument. What makes a bad argument, right? Unpacking that. And so I would like you actually, right now, to turn to somebody, preferably someone you don't already know, and if you have to kind of wiggle your chairs a little bit, do that, and each spend about 3 minutes answering the question, what makes a bad argument? And then we're going to come back here in about 5 minutes. So as we come back here, and don't worry, you're going to get another chance to engage with each other here, but we actually wanted to allow the room to hear each other's actual reactions and responses and wisdom on this simple foundational human question of what makes a bad argument. So we've got several mic runners around the room here. Annie here, Azalea here, Danielle over there. And so let's just start anywhere. We've got one hand up here. Right behind you, you got a mic coming.
Well, and I'd like to turn the mic over to my colleague here after I comment, because he had some points to make as well. But I felt like two aspects were really important were... My name is Ben Benson, and I'm from Austin, Texas.
Beautiful, thank you.
And two things I felt were important were respect and facts. And then through our discussion, we also started to talk about the importance of tolerance and a willingness to understand the other person's perspective. And did you want to add something?
No, you just reflected what we talked about.
Okay.
So one of the things, and I don't want to be pedantic, but I think it actually is an interesting distinction to make. You've just named in a very... you're somebody I want to hang out with because I just gave you a negative question and you answered in the affirmative. You just told what makes a better argument, right? But my question actually is, what makes a bad argument? I want us to name the things that make a bad argument, right? So we've got a couple hands. Yeah, right here. We'll start. Yeah. Tell us who you are.
Hello, everyone. My name is Style Ranger. I am a current Bessel scholar. I just wanted to include the viewpoint that what makes a bad argument is when people don't seek first to understand, then to be understood. Like my partner, Faith here, she was saying, like, when you have an argument against someone and you're talking to them, they're like, and you can tell, like, they're automatically thinking of, oh, no, that's not right. Like, what their opinion is, they're not seeking to understand your opinion. And when people don't do that, they're just stuck in their own viewpoint, in their own perspective, without trying to understand your perspective. And that's what makes a bad argument.
I love that. That's great. Thank you. We'll come back. Let's come actually up front here. We've got a hand, and then we'll swing back over to this side here. Yep.
Hi, my name is Kayo Jolisa. I'm from Cameroon. I'm a Bezos scholar. So I really loved what Christina mentioned. She said what makes a bad argument is when people get in with a winning mindset. And when you have a winning mindset, you're not able to listen, you're not able to learn from your partner, and that's really what makes a bad argument. Thank you.
Okay, I love this. So these first two comments are very connected, right? The idea that you're not listening, and you're already beginning to plan your rebuttal. But the idea that the reason why you're doing that is you're oriented around winning, right? Okay, we've got a microphone over here.
Hi, I'm Natalie Burke from Common Health Action in Washington, D.C. And Allison pointed out when someone enters an argument and they are immovable, that is one thing that will make the argument bad. And a thing that I would add is destructive discomfort. The very nature of an argument requires some level of discomfort. And when it's destructive, there's no chance that you'll be successful in coming to common ground. So the goal should be constructive discomfort.
Okay, love that. Thank you. We'll come back over here to, yep.
Ronnie Schmier from Birmingham, Michigan. And if there's any sense in this give and take of any intimidation, that completely negates the discussion. So any intimidation, whether it's a superior to inferior, or any sense that of that, you got a problem.
Did everybody catch that? The idea of intimidation, if that element is woven into the dialogue or argument, that's going to make it a bad argument. We got some hands way back here. Give Danielle a chance to work a mic. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jose Munoz from Chicago, and very similar to what the last gentleman just said is like we talked a little bit about this and believe that a bad argument is when there is an imbalance of power. When one side of the argument has more power than the other, then there is no argument. They're just going to move forward with whatever they want.
Great. So I think that's a very important little addendum there, right? Because inherent in the question of intimidation is the question of power and how power is unequally allocated in many situations, many arguments, but naming that, I think, is... and so what you're saying is that when there is not just a power imbalance in an argument, but when it is being exploited in the argument, that the argument tends to go south. We've got one hand back here, and then we'll swing back here, and then I'm going to button it up for our next chance for you to talk to each other here.
My partner Tariq pointed out that a lack of focus or agenda tends to create a bad argument.
Why? Say more.
Because the unfocus means that you get into what I think someone else called uncomfortable, what was it? Non-constructive discomfort. And I think that it can also attacks can become personal instead of focused on the issue at hand.
Okay, wonderful. We'll come swing over here to the front. I don't know who's got a mic. It's coming.
I think
Gary, introduce yourself.
Gary Lauder. I'm a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley. When I was in high school, I was fortunate to have learned something from a friend, not from my school, which everyone should learn, which are informal fallacies. These are, there's a taxonomy, a description of many of the different linguistic tricks that humans use to trick each other to believe what is inherently a non-logical argument. Just Google it, informal fallacies. Everyone should ad hominem is an example when you're criticizing the person speaking rather than the idea spoken. And there's a long list of these. We should all have them top of mind.
I love that. So Gary's, this list of fallacies, it reminds me of a book. There's a great historian named David Hackett Fisher who wrote a book, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago now called Historians' Fallacies. Which is for his craft and profession kind of an analog to this. And he just catalogs all the ways in which either historians or people who are trying to use history for one political purpose or another will fall into fallacies of argument making and the rest. There's one last thing that I actually want to name here. Let's give one last chance here, because maybe it'll come out here instead of me having to name it here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm April McLean Delaney. I actually work with a nonprofit called Common Sense Media. But I think it's distrust, but also a lack of relationship and knowing. And if you think about it, there's also different types of arguments in different types of environments. There's an interpersonal argument. There's a mass media argument, whether you're talking about CNN to Fox. There's also a social media component. And when there's anonymity and lack of accountability, it's much easier to engage because there's a lack of a relationship. And I think that's a really important thing because you are able to amplify and exacerbate differences. That's fantastic. That is literally the point that I wanted to add here. And so it's just beautiful that the wisdom of the room always prevails. So now what I'd like us to do, actually, you've already gotten your mind into, and I'm sure for some of you, maybe it was a little bit upsetting to conjure up recent or at least very salient bad arguments that you've been in. But I want you to actually think about the converse now. Think about a good argument you've been in. One where, yeah, you got into some discomfort, but it was constructive discomfort. And perhaps it was about something civic, or perhaps it was about household chores. It doesn't matter, right? The question of an argument that could have gone sideways, could have gone poorly, but somehow you all, in the dance of engagement there, made it better, right? And so the question now, for the next 5 or 6 minutes or so, and indeed, actually, to the extent that it's possible in these tables to turn to somebody different now, talk about the question, what makes a better argument? And we'll come back in about 5 minutes.
How did that feel, first of all? Did that feel different than the first question? Yeah, a different kind of energy. I could feel the energy in a different way. So we still got our mic runners around. Let's hear from some folks about what was said, what you all thought in this question of what makes a better argument.
My name is Christian Alexander from Hawthorne, California. I, too, am one of the Bezos scholars, and really what goes into a good argument is just a level of civility and respect for the other person.
Okay. So respect. So one of the questions that I have, actually, I'll start with, stick with you, Christian, and with maybe some of the other, Bezos scholars, is respect in an argument situation to be given or to be earned?
Really, thank you. In a way, it's a mix of both in the sense that when you go into the argument, you should go in with respect to the other person. And while the argument is going on, the way how you address them is, like, let's say that they're also very civil and understanding, so your respect for them would go on, and it's more of an understanding of the other person. But if the person is really like loud or yelling at you, then in that case you have to respect them in a different way and just understand that, oh, they're coming at me in this different way, and that I need to just sort of respond differently than normal.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Christian. That's very, we will come back to that because you could unpack a lot in respond differently than how I would normally, right? Yeah, we'll come over here and then we'll swing back to you, Zelia.
I'm Ina Fried with Axios. I'm a moderator for another session. I think the idea that coming into it that you don't have to be wrong for the other person to be right, and a willingness to accept that there's an experience that you lack that leads them to their perspective, that the difference might stem from different experiences.
I love that. So you don't have to be wrong in order for the other person to be right. But the other piece, I think, is a very related but very distinguishable thing, this idea of, you're describing, in a sense, humility, whether intellectual or emotional humility, right? I may come with a strong view, but it is not a panoptic view. I can't see it all, right? Okay, very interesting. Yes, over here.
Robert Rosencrantz. I'm the chairman of Intelligence Squared Debate, so I've thought about a lot of these questions a lot. And I think I'll start with a quote from John Stuart Mill. The man who only knows his own side of the argument knows little of that. So I think the starting point of a good argument is an appreciation of where the other people are coming from, so that you can frame your debates or frame your arguments not in an echo chamber fashion that you might use to address people you agree with, but in a respectful mode that has sensitivity to the underlying assumptions of the people on the other side. And we find in our debates that probably 40% of all the people who attend vote differently before and after hearing the arguments. Yeah. And the thing that's even more gratifying is that those that don't change their mind will frequently say, there was an intellectual or moral case on the other side that I might not have been persuaded by it, but it's really quite respectable, and I was really interested to hear it. So that, to me, is a very good argument, and we're going to be doing 2 of our debates in this Ideas Festival, so we hope you'll all come and find.
That's fantastic. And if you don't know Intelligence Squared and both the events they do and the media they create off those, Google them as well. Just a real great practitioner of how you do this. But what you're describing is this idea of, when you say understanding where the other person's coming from, that language colloquially we often use to mean emotionally, right? Where you're coming from emotionally. But you're also describing, I think, just where you're coming from philosophically. Like, why do you have the worldview that you have, right? What are the values that you have, and how are those values formed by what experience or by what teachers or by whatever it might have been, formative moments. And I think there's a thing that, I bet this is a room with a much higher than average proportion of people who did debate at one point in high school or otherwise. And so this is it's certainly a room with a much higher proportion than the average of lawyers. But outside of those 2 realms, kind of high school debate and law school, most Americans don't get exposed to any notion of practicing stepping into the other person's shoes and having to make their arguments well, right? And so I think that's a piece of it. I've got time for 1 or 2 more here. Got a hand way back here. Oh, there's Chris. converging.
Thank you. Hi. By the way, Robert Rosencrantz didn't even scratch the surface on the many things he does to make the world better. Just saying.
Tell us who you are, Chris.
I'm Chris Gates, and I'm from New York City. And one of the things that helps, like on those rare occasions that I actually find myself participating in a good argument, it's because I imagine wanting a relationship after the fact with that person. So it's kind of contextual. There's a context of relationship that, I'm trying to avoid using the word Trump, that trumps whatever the content of the argument is.
Thank you. One here, and then we'll do one final one back by the camera there. Tell us your name.
My name is James Markle. I live in Denver, Colorado. I'm here with GoSun. I wanted to first say that we were both watching you that second round, and we were curious to know if it was going to take you longer to quiet the crowd after the positive rather than the negative in the beginning. And it did. Yeah. A lot of positive energy here. Thank you all. So some of the things that we discussed were fun, which I think comes with empathy, knowing, again, rolling right off, wanting the relationship, but also authenticity and vulnerability in the conversation. Knowing where you're coming from, being authentic about where you're coming from, the experience that you might have that is driving that argument, and then the vulnerability in saying, I might be wrong, or this is my share, and this makes me vulnerable, and you can see that, and so here you can trust me, and you can hear what I'm saying.
That's really wonderful and powerful, and when you think about the ways in which, we'll talk more about it, but it's rare, is the main point I was going to say, to step into that kind of vulnerability. Again, this is the nature of the vicious circle of our political culture, right? The harder it is to be vulnerable, the harder it is to be vulnerable. And that feeds on itself in a very dangerous way. Okay, last comment from you, sir.
Yeah, Brian Coakley from New York City. There's a couple points I guess I would make. One is a good argument or better argument is one that honestly uses and doesn't intentionally misrepresent statistics to push a certain agenda, or maybe provides the appropriate context for those statistics. And another would be a good argument is one that starts with the overarching unifying goal before launching into all the supporting points.
Wonderful. So one of the reasons why we designed this deep dive this way was that I don't call myself an optimist. I actually think there's optimism, pessimism is the wrong frame to use. I call myself someone who is hopeful. And the difference between optimism and hope is that optimism generally implies a situation where you have no agency, right? I'm optimistic the Yankees are going to win the World Series this year. In fact, I'm damn sure of it, right? But I actually have nothing to do with the outcome, right? My cheering is not going to affect whether they in fact win the World Series this year. I can be optimistic. I am hopeful that we are actually, as a country, going through a hard passage, that we're going to come out the other side of being able to sustain a different kind of polity and a different kind of civic community. And on that, I'm hopeful because I have something to do with the outcome, right? I have both agency and responsibility. And we designed this deep dive this way because we are hopeful ultimately, and all the ways in which your conversations went, and just this small sampling of the ideas that came out of these conversations validate the idea that we are actually able to heal the body politic. We are, right? Our leaders may not be able to. Our leaders may not want us to, and there are a lot of structures and systems that are incentivized against this, but there is a deep, deep amount of wisdom in this room. And I know this is not an ideologically uniform room. Right? It is not an economically uniform room. It is not an experientially uniform room. So in a room like this, we still are capable of reminding ourselves both of what goes bad in a bad argument and what goes good in a good one. And what is beautiful about what you all had to say here is that basically you did my job for this last beat before I bring up our panel, because what I was supposed to do here is summarize some of the learnings that we've had in the first many months of our groundwork and focus groups around the Better Arguments Project. And I want to actually just name some of these lessons from year one, and in a sense rename them, because you all have articulated most of them. So I think in the first place, as several of you said, recognizing the underlying context for all of our civic debates. And so there are three dimensions to this that are really important for us to be mindful of. One, I alluded to in my opening remarks, which is history, right? Understanding that every fight we have today about immigration, about health care, about taxes, about the minimum wage, Every one of these fights is a recapitulation of one of those 5 or 6 core American arguments that I was describing at the beginning. We are having a fight about liberty versus equality. We're having a fight about strong central government versus local control. We're having a fight about individual responsibility versus collective responsibility, right? And that the history of political and civic debates in this country has something to teach us about how we can make our way through these conversations today and debates today. The second element is about emotion. And I think many of you named this, whether in talking about vulnerability or talking about the ways in which if someone's going to come at you in a kind of an angry way, you have to adjust the way you're going to come back at them, right? And you have a choice to make there, just in that moment, right? Whether you are going to mirror and double down or whether you're going to be the one who says, all right, whatever my age, I mean, you're a young man, I'm going to be the grown-up here, and I'm going to de-escalate, and I'm going to take this a different place, right? That choice about emotion and kind of emotional literacy that goes along with the kind of historical and philosophical literacy, being emotionally intelligent about the patterns that we fall into. As I mentioned earlier, Facing History and Ourselves is one of our deep partners in this work, but so is the Allstate Corporation. And those of you who've spent time at Aspen know that Allstate has this work, particularly around young people and the formation of kind of a sense of civic character, a sense of what is good, what does it mean to live in a good way in civic life, right? And that at the heart of debates about what is the good life and what is a good community are not intellectual abstractions, they are emotions, fear, pain, hope, shame, right? Dread, yearning, love, that we don't name in our politics. All our politics today, right now, you think about the arguments that are going on about the separated migrant families, right? There are policy particulars to those. There are facts about those, facts that people on both sides don't want to admit. People don't want to admit how close the Trump policy, where it's ending up, is to where the Obama policy left off. People don't want to compute that, right? Because they've got a lot of emotional investment in what's going on right now. So the second dimension of being emotionally aware, and one of the people who has been very formative in our work here, a guy from Utah, a guy named C. Terry Warner, who's a retired professor at BYU, wrote a book called Bonds That Make Us Free. And he describes in this book, which is about human dynamics of relationship at every scale, from interpersonal to international and intercultural. He describes this cycle that goes like this: I accuse you to excuse me. I accuse you to excuse me, right? So you go home later after Ideas Festival and your family member, you come home and you see, the dishes are all piled up in the sink, house is a mess, and you say to your loved one or to your kid, hey, why didn't you do the dishes? What's going on here? And their first natural human reaction is to say to you, well, why didn't you take out the garbage before you left? Right? Accuse to excuse, right? The cycle of what Warner calls shirking responsibility continuously, which isn't just about household chores, it's Black Lives Matter. Well, why don't all lives matter, right? Why don't all lives matter is not actually a substantive, thoughtful response to the claim that Black Lives Matter. It is accusing to excuse, right? And our politics on all sides is filled with that. So that's a second piece. The third piece, which many of you named here, talking about intimidation, talking explicitly about power, is recognizing that an argument goes better if you can be candid at the beginning of recognizing the power dynamics in it, naming them. Just naming them changes them, right? So if you're a young Bezos scholar here, and you're walking across the campus at Aspen here, and you bump into a billionaire, right? And you get into a conversation which turns into a political argument. And the billionaire can say, well, young lady, young man, let me tell you from my authority, from my wealth, from my experience, from my knowledge. And you've got to be able to start at the beginning of saying, hey, I know we start at different power differentials, but I want us to both kind of have this conversation recognizing that each of us brings different kind of knowledge to the table here, right? I don't have a billionaire's knowledge, but you don't have a young person's knowledge, a young person of 2018, right? And we both got something to bring here to this conversation. But naming those power dynamics is an important dimension of actually being able to not transcend them. We are not Pollyanna here. Power is power, and that's a whole other topic and a topic of a book of mine about citizen power. But it helps things go better if you name them. And then finally, there are 5 tenets of a better argument that we actually drew up in a kind of an interim report, which you can find on our website for our program, the Citizenship and American Identity program at the Aspen Institute. And if you just Google the Better Arguments Project, which our partners, again, at Allstate have really helped us shape because they've been doing work that's grounded in community, working with young people, working with neighbors who are trying to make sense of what it means to build a beloved community. So I'm going to name these, but they're going to be familiar to you because you all said them. Number one, take winning off the table. I forget who said that, right? But that's just literally one. And a variant of that is what the last comment was, which is identifying some shared goal of what we're trying to get out of this argument, right? Take winning off the table is a radical idea. Like, I'm arguing with you to understand, not necessarily to win, right? And as someone else said here, it is possible to be wrong in a way that doesn't have to mean the other person's right, or vice versa, right? Number two, again, as was said by several of you, prioritize relationships and listen passionately. The problem with political argument today in an age that is so mediated, either cable TV mediated or social media mediated, is that we have gotten habituated to penalty-free trashing of each other. There is no price you pay for flaming somebody in that mediated way, right? But if you're in relationship with somebody, whether family, whether somebody you just met at the Aspen Ideas Festival, something else, relationship holds you in a different space and different context, which is the third takeaway here. Pay attention to context, right? There are debates that are going on in our country about, for instance, the enforcement of laws, right? So the argument for what's happening at the border is about the enforcement of laws. And the enforcement of laws matters. Yes, it does. But context matters also, right? And the context within which the discretion of officials at the border are making decisions matters in just the same way that the context. I was in Atlanta over the weekend and happened to walk upon a traffic cop going off on a guy, an African-American guy who had a little ice cream cart, which apparently didn't have a permit. And she was going off on him, yelling at him, berating him. And I just walked up to her and said, "Ma'am, what's going on here?" And she told me all the things he'd done wrong. It was the second time he told him that day he had to have the right permits and everything. She was, quote, right? This guy was in the wrong, quote. But I said to her, "Ma'am, you're the one with a gun and a badge. You don't have to raise your voice." and that kind of that broke the circuit for her, right? But it was remembering that in that context of how you actually are engaging around what seems to be a universal principle of obey the law, you have to take that into account. The fourth takeaway, embrace vulnerability, literally. So just as James was saying, and again, this goes back to what C. Terry Warner was saying about accuse to excuse. He finally says in that book, there's only one way to break the cycle of accuse to excuse, and that is to break the cycle. It is to be the one that says, okay, I will be the grown-up. I will take responsibility, even though I didn't, quote, start it. Right? And every one of us can relate to that feeling of, I didn't start this. I'm not going to be the first one to extend the olive branch. Extend the olive branch, right? That embrace of vulnerability is huge. And then finally, our principle that we call make room to transform, but I think actually it can be captured this way, which is you cannot possibly change another person's mind unless you are willing to have your own mind changed. You may score points, you may be able to kind of rack up debater points, but you won't change their mind if they sense that you're not willing to have your mind changed. And that is a matter of mindset, but also heart set. And I think ways in which these questions and these tenets play out. Take winning off the table, prioritize relationships, pay attention to context, embrace vulnerability, and make room for that kind of transformation of yourself. These are habits that, on the one hand, are not rocket science, and thank God they're not rocket science. We can now all practice them in civic life, and we can make a different contagion of a different culture of argumentation. And so now what we're going to do, I want to invite our esteemed panelists to just come on up here as I'm talking here. And as we come up, I will introduce them, and we're going to spend the balance of our time in conversation about how these dynamics of argument and argument in our culture are playing out and some possible paths forward. So, Deborah, actually, why don't you sit here? I'll sit next to me. I'll sit in the middle here. Yeah. Yeah. What's that? I'll be okay. Yeah, you'll be okay? Yeah, why don't you come right here? That's great. one chair here. So as we're getting set up here, let me introduce our...
My mic just went down my shirt.
Okay, I'll vamp for time as you fish out your mic. We are joined by a wonderful panel here. So you've seen their bios if you've got the program or the app, but let me just tell you quickly. First, both physically and literally and metaphorically to my right, Ramesh Ponnuru, who is a senior editor at the National Review magazine, a columnist for Bloomberg, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a leading voice and thinker of conservatism in our age, which I think is a very fruitful thing because there are arguments that are happening nowadays that are not so much between conservatives and liberals, but between and among people who are trying to define the true heart of conservatism. So we'll come back to that. Those of you who were in our prior session that was in the space about voting got to hear the question from our next panelist here, Mayor Michelle de la Isla, who is the mayor of Topeka, Kansas, the first Hispanic mayor elected of Topeka, Kansas. And someone with a long career in public service, nonprofit, and community work in Kansas and beyond. Next, really honored to be joined by Deborah Tannen, professor of linguistics at Georgetown, author of, how many is it now, 19, 20 books?
25.
25 books, okay, sorry, 25 books. I was in the margin of error. 25 books about different dimensions of communication. One book which bears particularly on this topic, is about the argument culture. But she's written many, in civic and public life, but she's written many, many other books about communication, particularly intergender communication, and arguments and relationships and the ways that our language and unspoken language inform and shape those. And then finally, last but not least, joined by a professor at Stanford, Rob Reich, who we were commiserating earlier because Rob Reich, spelled Reich, gets often mistaken for Bob Reich of a different California institution. We're also commiserating because both our last names get mangled in many situations, something, Ramesh, you know nothing about, right? But Rob is a professor of philosophy, a leader not only in questions about philosophy and democracy, but more recently, particularly around digital democracy and the ethics of digital democracy, and leading some very interesting work there about how habits that we're falling into and forming online are either constructive or destructive for our culture of argumentation. So I want to pose this initial question to all of you to speak very briefly to, and then we're going to just open it up into a more free-flowing discussion and leave some time for Q&A here. But that first question was just, tell us about the most constructive civic argument you've been part of recently that you can remember. Ramesh, let's start with you.
I was so afraid I was going to be the first one to ask. It was actually a chastening experience thinking about this panel beforehand and trying to come up with an example of a constructive argument I've been in, since I aspired for my arguments to be constructive going forward. And my 13-year-old daughter, when I was talking to my family about this, said, why don't you tell them about when we argued about whether I should have a cell phone? And I said, well, you know, your mother and I, we didn't convince you we were right. We just convinced you we weren't yielding. So I don't know if that's really a great example. The thing that strikes me about the public arguments I've been involved in over the last 5 to 10 years especially, is the ones where the most headway has been made, where there's been kind of cross-partisan common ground and alliance, have tended to be issues that are not front-burner issues, that aren't the ones that get everybody riled up. So I think I've been part of constructive arguments about occupational licensing, where there are conservatives and liberals who, from different premises, but from some shared goals, can both see that maybe we need to change what we've been doing. In the area of monetary policy, where I've done a lot of work over the last several years, the same thing. But the somewhat disheartening thing about that is that it doesn't seem to translate into constructive work on the more hot button questions. So for one last example of this, criminal justice reform is something where there's been an enormous amount of on-the-ground success, but I think precisely to the extent that it's been a low salience issue. And when it has threatened to become more of a front burner issue, it's become much more problematic in terms of actually getting anything done.
Because people revert to their tribal norms and their kind of the vested interests of each side? Is that?
That's right, because it becomes team red versus team blue under those circumstances.
I was going to ask whether criminal justice reform, around which there has been a lot of red-blue, left-right, kind of orthogonal to a left-right axis collaboration, but as you say, more below the radar. And once it started rising above the radar, onto the radar, that started shifting.
And it also, because it was behind the scenes, anti-social media didn't take it over.
Yeah. I like that phrase, anti-social media. We'll come back to that. Mayor, what about for you? I mean, you know, you've been in office, in the mayor's office a relatively short time, but you've been involved in the civic life of Topeka for a good long time. I was looking at the paper online and seeing arguments that you were having about whether to extend a sales tax, a 10-year sales tax, or whether the city should keep on funding the Performing Arts Center. These kinds of issues around which people will get into arguments that aren't about national politics or even about like Trump versus not Trump, but about, how do you do a thing right at a local level? Have you had a constructive experience of constructive arguments there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that it was interesting coming into office, being the first minority. And in September 28th, we had the fatal shooting of a young man called Dominique White. He happened to be half Caucasian, half African-American young man, and he was shot by 2 Caucasian officers. And coming into the role of being mayor-elect, which was really interesting because I was still not mayor at the point that the heat started rising in that conversation in our community. And hearing out the context of the argument, and then Black Lives Matters coming in because we had a side of the argument that said, here's the state regulations, we're not to release the video, and we are not to do these things that you're asking me for. Then I'm coming back from the US Conference of Mayors and I'm asking all the other mayors that have been through this, how do we handle this best? And they're saying, well, you release the video and you engage the family, and then you have legal saying don't engage the family because they've hired an attorney. And you have to just put yourself in a position, and we were talking about this at our table, in which you understand that the heat in an argument is rising and that you have to let it rise to a point in which you show enough vulnerability to admit that you don't have all the answers and to understand the context of where the arguments were coming from. So it was really interesting to see how there were some games being played, but in the end, we ended up having a community forum. And all of us leaders sat down and listened and allowed the community to grieve and allowed the community to express that emotion. And we were put in the position that we had the opportunity, if we chose to do so, to be vulnerable and to understand what the argument really was about. In the process, we ended up, of course, the law was not a city law, but we ended up having a conversation at the state level. We changed the time frame because before it was the video will never be shown. Now we have a 20-day, I think, that you can actually see the video. And it's been amazing to see what reaching out and being vulnerable and going into the neighborhoods, talking to understand what it is that the neighborhoods were wanting and not prescribing the solutions that we thought that had to happen, and understanding that if we push the conversation too much, you were going to have law enforcement become upset, and then you could have some further negative repercussions in the community. But just bringing everybody into the fold and listening and not trying to be anybody's savior, trying to understand. It was beautiful to see how eventually, rather than having a riot, which there was a lot of talk about, we ended up having Department of Justice, the community coming together, and now we're working towards solutions. So that's the most
very powerful
one.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Deborah, this part of what is implicit in what the mayor's saying here is the notion of leadership. She was leading in a way that brought a more constructive argument. And I think one of the messages of all your books, all your work, is that kind of leadership in leading a conversation a certain way has nothing to do, or is not primarily about whether you have a title like mayor or whether you have an office, that anybody in any kind of interaction can lead this way. So tell us about a constructive argument that you've been in that actually, where you feel like that has played out.
Well, I have no experience at all comparable to that. Maybe I'll follow the first a private, then a public one, but they'll both be brief. Thinking of an argument, not a particularly significant one, that I had with my husband, and now we're married 30 years, so he's been very influenced by my See, I'm saying already, I'm the right one here.
He has seen the light over time.
I have argued over many years. By the way, there's making an argument and having an argument. So in the spirit of making an argument, I've made the argument over the years that apologies are among the most powerful weapons, you might say, that we have in having an argument. Because often, maybe this is kind of related to some things people said earlier, people want their experience acknowledged. And if you're having the argument, they've been upset or hurt by something. And it's a little bit like you want to make them wrong so you won't be wrong. Just acknowledging that you did something doesn't mean you did it on purpose, and apologizing for it is incredibly powerful in smoothing the waters. So we're approaching our 30th anniversary, and this was one of the most simple, insignificant arguments we ever had, because very early on we both apologized for our part in it. And by the way, that is something that in my work on the workplace, a book I wrote called Talking from 9 to 5, frequently women were told, don't apologize, it's not your fault. And they actually never thought it was their fault. But they were apologizing for a part of it, assuming that's going to encourage the other person to apologize for their part in it. And if they don't, like, don't do it again, then you wonder, why didn't I apologize? It wasn't my fault. But that ritual can be a very powerful one.
Well, it's interesting. Rob, one of the things that that dynamic right there of why would I be the sucker to apologize, right? Why would I be the one to break the cycle of accuse to excuse and take responsibility? The other person might not reciprocate, right? They might even exploit it. You use the word weapon. They might use my apology as a weapon against me, right?
I think that is one, and we're often told, never apologize, never explain. And that is assuming you want to win. And if you apologize, you're weakening your position.
Rob, you're working with so many, young people, but also people who are young, but not so young anymore, who are old enough to know better, I guess, put it that way, right? Who are learning their social mores through anti-social media and the rest. From that perspective, what's been a constructive argument that you've witnessed or been part of?
Yeah, I'm going to play the predictable role of a philosopher here. And as a philosopher, the kind of constructive arguments that I think about go all the way back to the scene setting in the context of a symposium. It usually involves food. Arguments, in my view, I think in all of our views, go oftentimes better over a social setting that involves food and drink. Now, that's not a guarantee of success, but notice impossible.
Food fights can result from
Food fights can result, but food.
Not if the drink is vodka.
Whatever the case may be, any digitally mediated argument can never involve food. And that's just among the pathologies that the digital public sphere happens to occasion for us. All the things we discussed earlier about authenticity, about vulnerability, about maintaining a personal relationship, arguing through digital means or intermediated by some web context so frequently makes that difficult. Emojis are currently almost the best mechanism we have, and think about how insufficient emojis are as a means for communication here, to signal relationship and communication and vulnerability. So that's one amongst many of the pathologies of our digital public sphere.
Ramesh, that makes me, Michelle, did you want?
No, I was just going to say, yesterday we were at the Four Freedoms conversation, and that was one of the things that I think that we really have to be cognizant of. When we use social media, it's a wonderful and powerful tool. It's got great ramifications. You could just create an upswell of people believing in your cause. But I think that we have to be very cognizant of the fact that we are dehumanizing individuals, because now they're just something out there that I don't have any relationship or any attachment to. And it seems very interesting that we have a crisis of empathy in this nation, in which we look for the people that feed our confirmation bias so much that sometimes people end up justifying the negative behaviors because everybody else is doing it. So absolutely, it's okay. And you end up not having real arguments because there's no way to have an argument with a screen.
Ramesh, that point right there, one of the things that has been so notable about our political culture of argument lately as I alluded to a moment ago, hasn't just been the right-left arguments, but the arguments intra-right, I guess, right, about the soul of conservatism, right? And that's some folks who call themselves never Trump conservatives, arguing against those who who feel like Trumpism is the proper province of the Republican Party and so forth. I've talked with you, some of your colleagues, about different dimensions of this. That arena as well is one where dehumanization starts happening very rapidly, right? And yet you all started with certain bonds of relationship, certain bonds of common language and so forth. How have you, just you, been navigating some of that work and kind of, and the different parts of the arguments that you've been in on those issues? And has it been possible to sustain relationships and humanization in the midst of some of this stuff that's gotten very hot within the right?
Right. So, when you were asking earlier what the definition of a bad argument is, it did strike me that part of the definition should be an argument that is taking place on Twitter. And one thing that I constantly remind myself is not to participate in arguments that are taking place on Twitter, because there has never been an occasion where I've stopped and thought, boy, I'm really glad I spent the last half hour doing that. I've really made my life and the world a better place as a result of that. I think that the point about dehumanization is really a crucial one. When we talk about those media, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, in terms of anonymity, the problem isn't just that anonymous people are attacking you.
Or bots.
I certainly have had a lot more interaction with Macedonians than I ever expected to in my life over the last few years. But that you are sort of, as opposed to when you're sharing food and drink, when you're dealing with an embodied physical person, you are dealing more with the idea of a person. And you can project onto that person qualities that may not fit. And the thing I try to do in any argument I have, whether it's with somebody who is, let's say, more Trump supportive than I am, or somebody who's well to my left, is I always want to start by thinking, could an intelligent person of goodwill hold this view that I'm arguing against? And B, let's be very charitable in trying to answer question A. So far, I don't think that I've lost any relationships as a result of these political arguments, but maybe it's just because people have stopped interacting with me.
Well, one of the things in the spirit of confession, and Ramesh, I'm not sure if you even remember this, but we first encountered each other 20 years ago, I think exactly, maybe 21 years ago, in disembodied form, arguing over MSNBC in different places about, at the time, there was this Asian money scandal unfolding around the Clinton administration. And we were, left, right in some argument, and I didn't know Ramesh. I only knew the idea of Ramesh, right? And we got fired up and we argued and it was hot. And it was just one of those,
I don't remember anything about that except that I was right.
Well, yeah, exactly, right? But I remember it because I came then in, later years to read Ramesh's stuff, to kind of understand the texture and the three-dimensionality of his work and his thinking, and life. And I was like, that was dumb. That was dumb what we did 20 years ago. That was a stupid way to, quote, meet, right? And yeah, Deborah.
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on why the spirit of opposition has become so corrosive. You were set up to do that. And this is what often is done on these shows. One from the left, one from the right, and you understand in a way that you're there to fight with each other. And I've had the experience, and many others I know have had this, you've got this thing in your ear and they're talking to you, the producers are talking to you. And if you start agreeing with each other, they get upset. Cut that out. You're there to argue. And my worst experience with this was when the book You Just Don't Understand came out. And in the green room, waiting to go and talk about this book, there's this guy, and he was wearing a shirt and tie and a long skirt, and he had waist-length red hair, so he was kind of there to be provocative. And in the green room, he said, now, I read your book, I think it's great, but when I get out there, I'm going to attack you because that's what I'm here for. And as soon as he got there, he almost had jumping out of his seat, and not just yelling at me, but yelling at women in general. And then they had people come on, and I'd been on so many of these shows where they would bring people on, talk about their personal experience, and the audience would then talk about their personal experience, and everybody would kind of experience their connections. This was completely opposite because the tone was set by that guy and the two of us. I mean, I sort of was trying to...
You didn't reciprocate.
Yeah, I mean, I was so taken aback because I'd been on the other kind of shows and hadn't been exposed to this yet. But so we had women there who came to talk about their personal experience, and people in the audience, there was studio audience, began insulting them. You know, you're selfish, you're a...
If I could just add to that, you know, it's even before you get to the stage of being on the stage. Years ago, this was when Dan Rather had scored an interview opportunity with Saddam Hussein before the war, and one of the cable channels asked me, do you want to go on and talk about this? And during the pre-interview, they said, aren't you outraged by this? I was like, no. I mean, this is the interview of a lifetime. I mean, I might have different questions that I'd ask, and you could just feel the interest in having me as a guest dissipate as I was talking. Yeah. And we're talking about healthy arguments and constructive arguments, but one of the things we need, of course, is a healthy culture of constructive arguments, which our media is not set up to facilitate.
Yeah, and I think, Rob, I mean, part of what everybody's talking about here in different ways, actually, is roles, right? Mm-hmm. The role of a mayor, the role of a pundit, the role of somebody who's been set up to argue with somebody or be ambushed by somebody, right? And social media and digital technology are so much about roles and avatars and kind of the projection of a self, right? Mm-hmm. Do you feel like actually the fact that a generation is growing up very mindful of roles, is there something we can actually do with that constructively to say, hey, there's a different role you can play. You don't have to be the flamethrower role. You could take the avatar of the person who's actually interested when you want to complicate the narrative and agree with Dan Rather, or interested when you want to, or do you feel like, no, the incentives and the nature of digital media are only kind of pointing us in that downward direction?
I'd want to shift the conversation away from the idea that, in that early New Yorker cartoon, no one knows you're a dog online. Now, of course, everyone knows who you are online, or at least the company surely does. Yeah. And away from the idea of what the user can do online, and more to what the engineer is doing within the company. What is the engineer optimizing for in sorting us into a newsfeed and exposing us to different points of view, in constructing the various echo chambers that are meant to engage us in various ways? The 5 rules of good argumentation that you laid out just before we came up on stage would be very difficult to implement as an optimization algorithm or an optimizing algorithm.
Right. To boost engagement.
To boost engagement. And I mean that partly as a result of the business model, which is looking to capture our eyeballs or keep us listening on screen. But also, you premise this whole conversation by saying the ultimate kind of tension is between liberty and equality, between the unibus and pluribus. And if you don't have an objective function which you're meant to maximize or efficiently optimize over, that's alien to the world of an engineer who's trying to figure out what to program into the algorithm to give it a consistent outcome.
I want to actually pivot in a moment to questions here, and we still have our mic runners around the room. But one thing that really strikes me, this idea of the engineer, if there's one thing I think you can already absorb from what everybody's saying here, is that they're engineers in the sense of the people who write code and algorithms for a Facebook or a Twitter and so forth. But there's another way of thinking about it. Maybe it's not even the metaphor of the engineer, it's the metaphor of the gardener, right? We are all gardeners, and we can all decide to tend garden plots that have a different set of dynamics and rules and parameters from those that engineers at Facebook or Twitter or whatever are optimizing for to meet their business model. And I think one thing that as you begin to ask your questions, to be thinking, again, you are not audience here. You are the creators. You are the participants. You are the people who are going to go back out in the country and pass on, hopefully, the best of what's come out of this conversation. And so if you're a gardener, think about what's the plot that you're tending and what are the questions that you want to ask folks here about how you can be a better gardener of those kinds of conversations. So with that, are there questions that anybody wants to pose to? Okay, we got actually, let's go to the fellow in the striped shirt because we haven't heard from him yet, and then we'll swing back around to this side.
Hi, my name is Cole Fairchild. I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm a Bezos scholar. My question is, you talk a lot about this is about how to have good arguments. And so being from Charlottesville, as hopefully a lot of you know what happened about a year ago where neo-Nazis and white supremacists self-proclaimed neo-Nazi white supremacists come to my city. How do I have a good argument with someone that thinks I'm inferior, that doesn't respect my humanity by nature?
First of all, thank you for that question, because I think it is powerful and pertinent not just in a Charlottesville, but in a lot of arenas where right now, if the humanity of one party in an argument is not even being accepted as the premise, what is possible there?
So what I would say to you, first of all, your humanity is beautiful and valuable. So if you ever feel like somebody is trying to take that away from you and strip it away from you, don't let them. Second, I would say you have to understand where the point is of seeing where the heat is so high of the argument that you sometimes have to walk away, and you create the argument outside of the argument. So you congregate with people that maybe you can help understand and have better arguments with, and elevate that voice. And then by virtue of you having further conversations that validate your point of view, you're able to start influencing. And again, here is where social media is a great advocate for you to do that. Community convening is a great avenue for you to do that. But you should never, in an argument, put yourself in harm's way. You have to know, part of an argument is knowing when you have to say pause, and I'm going to walk away and I'm going to figure out a way to communicate, because an argument takes two people communicating, and at the point in time in which there is no interest, you have to be safe with yourself.
The one thing I would add, just in response to that, is to think about a young Thurgood Marshall, Thurgood Marshall we understand as a Supreme Court jurist, and before that as the great litigator in Brown versus Board of Education, but for decades before that, he was plowing the field of these court cases, trying to build a different environment so that it could be contemplated that the 14th Amendment equal protection laws would apply to African Americans in the Jim Crow South. And in so doing, he had to have arguments with all kinds of people in the South who denied his humanity, right? Who scorned him, who did not want to acknowledge him as human. And he took that advice. He didn't get himself in danger and harm's way, but there was a sense of kind of core, calm confidence in his own humanity that allowed him to make arguments in ways that he didn't feel like he needed to prove his humanity to anybody. He simply needed to kind of make his case. And if someone didn't want to hear it, it was only underscoring further his humanity, right? And so there are times where you have to disengage, and there are times where I think you can learn how to engage coolly with the knowledge that that the law or the right or morality is on your side. Ramesh.
So just 2 points. First of all, I think we should have a presumption of good faith and goodwill when we're engaged with other people in an argument. But that presumption is rebuttable. And if you are marching with a swastika and you are chanting the Jews will not replace us, I think it has been pretty comprehensively rebutted, and there's just no point to getting into an argument with somebody who's taking that. Number two, where you draw the line, I think, changes over time. I mean, there is a kind of a legitimately relativistic element here in that a person who grew up in 1950s Mississippi, a white person, an intelligent person of goodwill, to get back to what I was saying earlier, could have supported segregation. Nobody who's intelligent and of goodwill at this point can do so. So, I mean, I think that a position that was not in itself a sign of vicious character now is one. And you can just say, no, I'll argue about you with other people, but I'm not going to argue with you.
Let's take one from over here. Yes. All right.
Hi, my name is Neri Martinez, and I'm a Republican political professional. One of my pet peeves, and maybe it's because I'm on the cusp of millennial, designation, is that I don't have a television in my home. I follow the news. I'm inundated with news before I get to the office. So I feel like I stay current on events, but I just can't watch, the news when I get home. And I've been this way long before I was a political professional, probably 15 or 16. I didn't like the 5 o'clock news either. I just found not productive, so I read all my news. But when it comes to arguing, I think we haven't talked about the role of media and the market for outrage and punditry, which I think is driving a negative culture for positive arguments, and setting the tone for that. And, if any of the panelists could talk about, how they see that changing or how we can change that before everybody just gets turned off by it.
Is it possible to create essentially a counterculture of media? Who'd like to dive in?
I'll say one quick thing. I, perhaps unlike everyone else on the panel, have zero experience in television, punditry, media shows, and I have lots of experience in the classroom environment. The incentives are totally different. Someone used the phrase earlier before, you need to create a space for productive discomfort. That's task number one for a teacher, to leave open a space within a classroom environment so that people can feel authentic enough and vulnerable enough to put their views on the line openly and with honesty. And for what it's worth, that's what seems to me completely the opposite of what happens when a television light goes on or social media gets in the way.
Well, as a person who works in print media, God bless you for your preference for it. I would just say, as consumers of media, we have choices. We can reward responsible, sensible, thoughtful commentary over the attempt to stoke up outrage in order to monetize it. Not to say that we should never be outraged. There are things that should outrage us, but we should stop and think, is this sort of a genuine thing, or is this an attempt to stoke these emotions in me for particular ends? There's all kinds of people doing great work around the country, and we choose who we want to engage with. We don't have to engage with Mike Huckabee's Twitter feed or Kathy Griffin's Twitter feed if we don't want to. Nobody's holding a gun to our heads.
Okay, we got time for one last question, and we'll take it from the middle of the room right here. It's coming to you.
Yes, my name's Bob Rosenfeld, and I've been a lawyer for 40 years. So I bring that bias to all of this. We've talked a lot about what makes a good or bad argument, but the one thing I don't think we've talked a lot about is what makes a good or bad arguer. And in my experience, and you talked about Thurgood Marshall, developing a reputation for integrity and honesty and reasonableness is oftentimes critical to how the arguments go and so on. And there's some people, as I think Ramesh said, some people that you just don't argue with because they have a reputation and so on. But we all should know that we are building a pedigree, if you will, or a reputation that enhances or undermines our ability to make good or bad arguments.
Deborah, and then Mayor Owen.
Well, I want to make one point, because it's so little time left. We've been talking a lot about absolutes, what's a good, what's a bad. And it's so important to keep in mind that there are individual and cultural differences about all these things. There are cultures in which arguing is a positive value, and others in which having an argument is a negative value. So I studied this in Greek compared to Americans. Some of you may know, if you've been in Greece and you see people yelling and you think they're having an argument, they're not. They're just having a nice discussion. A student of ours did this with German versus American, and a colleague of mine in the German department would advise our students going to Germany as foreign students. She herself was German. And often the German students would immediately start to engage them in arguments by saying the most terrible things about the United States they could say, which they thought was really friendly, a really nice way to engage them. And the Americans would just clam up. And so the Germans would end up thinking they're ignorant, they're uninformed, they don't care. But of course, they had lots to say, but they weren't going to get in an argument with somebody they didn't know, especially about politics and religion, which were the two topics apparently German students often wanted to start conversations about.
Well,
and just one last thing. Yeah. I was surprised that nobody said for a good argument, you have to be rational and not emotional, because that's another thing. For many people, you have to be emotional or you don't care. And for others, I can't talk to you if you're going to get emotional. So I think we need to take into account these differences and know what the values are of the person we're talking to.
I want to give the final word, Mayor, to you, because in talking about, we've talked about here differences of culture. Deborah, you were speaking earlier about differences in gender in ways that arguments unfold and happen. But I also want to think about differences in place, right? As we've been talking about, I've been spending a fair amount of time recently in different parts of Kansas working with colleagues of yours. And one could posit that maybe there's a Kansas way of being civic life, or maybe a Topeka way of engaging. And maybe it's true or maybe it's not, but maybe part of the job of a mayor or a leader is to say, there's a Topeka way of how we're going to engage each other. And you were sort of embodying it in handling that crisis of a police shooting, right? And so how do you try to create a culture that's rooted in place for more healthy, constructive arguments?
So I think that's dangerous, because I think that if you try to have a conversation with regards to what happens on the coast, people have a conception of how things are handled, and then you look at the Midwest and they're like, oh, it's the Midwest. So no. What I would say, my counter to that would be that we should have a global culture of understanding, first and foremost, that we all are a universe, that we all have a unique experience, that the one thing that we do have in common is that we have one core human thread that makes us absolutely imperfect. And when we start with the premise of understanding that we are imperfect, that everybody has a different experience, and we go into arguments and conversations with curiosity rather than wanting to impose ourselves, then we start having better arguments. So if you want to call it the Topeka way for the world, absolutely, Topeka's awesome. But what I would like to have is everybody consider that the whole nation and the whole world is having the same situation that we're having. They're just having it in different ways. But we have to remember that we're all human. We all are different. We all have different contexts. And when we approach each other, let's do it with curiosity.
I love that. Thank you so much. Let me close with this final thought here. First of all, the Better Arguments Project at our program at Aspen, our next steps, to invite you into our next steps. With our partners at Allstate and at Facing History and ourselves, we're going to be spending over the next few months time in 3 different communities around the country, a very interesting cross-section of communities where people raised their hand and reached out to us. Dumas, Arkansas, Anchorage, Alaska, and Queens, New York. And we're going to be spending deep time in those places, not doing public events, not doing things where people have to perform in roles or what have you, but just doing some deep listening about the arguments that are happening there and the cultures of conversation and argument that are happening there. And out of that, we will plan over the coming months to build out a range of public events that will be unfolding in somewhat of the spirit that we've just been doing here today, right? And that's the note that I want to close on here. I said every one of us is a gardener here. I think the other language that was used in this conversation is about incentives, right? You're designers. Every one of us is a designer. We are designing spaces all the time. It could be a dinner party. How do we gather for dinner? It could be a Rotary Club. How do we gather for Rotary? It could be a meeting of our political organization. How do we spend time together, right? If you just say, oh, we're going to have food and we're going to just kind of hang out and there's an agenda, whatever. But if you just take it up one notch to design with intention, with all the things that we've been talking about here, with this knowledge of your own imperfection, leading with a spirit of humility, humanizing in this way, listening to understand and not to win, if you build into the gatherings that you create in every circle of your life some of those design principles, we will actually be the counterculture. I really do believe this. We will be the radical counterculture in this country that is going to push us back to a more sane and humane way of having arguments in politics. And it's got to start with us. And I hope you'll join me in thanking this panel for giving us some great ideas for how to do that. Thank you. Thank you all for your participation in this gathering. Thank you.